Welcome to No Need to Argue, a podcast where we explore the truth as some see it. No Need to Argue is presented in seasons and looks at a topic over the course of 8 episodes. At No Need to Argue, we believe that knowledge stems from discussion where the aim is not victory of one side, but progress in thought for all. My name is Ashley Schlafly, one of your 2 co-hosts, and tonight we will be tackling the topic of 12-step and non-12-step programs in the rooms of NA, AA, and more. Before we get started, though, I need to introduce my co-host, Tom Schlafly. How are you doing tonight, Tom?
I'm doing well, Ashley. Thank you.
As I said, tonight we're going to be looking at recovery programs, both 12-step and otherwise. These programs we feel are an interesting counterpart to our episode we completed on the rehabilitation industry, both because they usually are a counterpart to inpatient treatment programs, as well as an alternative to those either without the means to attend rehabs or for those that do not feel they're at the point of needing the types of services rehabs offer. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is the largest of the 12-step programs that exist, with a membership that goes to approximately 155,000 meetings in 175 countries. NA, Narcotics Anonymous, is the second largest, with approximately 70,000 NA meetings taking place in 144 countries. Membership is simple for either organization, though. Desire to stop using. NA and AA are joined by groups such as Overeaters Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Eating Disorder Association meetings, and Al-Anon for those family members of addicts. Further, there are non-12-step options. Tonight, we're going to kind of talk through all of these. And as within the rest of the season, all of those discussions are going to be from our perspective, our time spent in the rooms, our time spent in meetings, and what we have gotten or perhaps not gotten out of them. And we received an influx of questions and comments about recovery programs that were asking us to address some questions, concerns, or just some ideas that our little No Need to Argue community has begun developing. Just so you know, all these people have given us permission to use their names on our podcast tonight, and we're looking forward to welcoming them into our discussion this evening. So we talked, Tom, about you being in rehab. And we talked about kind of how you got to rehab. But let's talk about your introduction to 12-step programs, because you did not become a member of NA after treatment. You went to some NA meetings, as most addicts do, before seeking inpatient treatment, correct?
Correct. They were AA meetings, but...
I didn't know that.
Sure. But, I went to... probably, I don't know, maybe 90 meetings in St. Louis, AA meetings. I would try out different ones. I never really got integrated into them. I think once after I went to rehab, it was helpful for me to have people who were also, I went to sober living after rehab. So people who were roommates of mine go with me to these meetings, because it can be kind of intimidating to go to a meeting by yourself, that you haven't been to before. So I started, once I left rehab and I was in sober living, I went to AA meetings, and I tried 2 different meetings, and there weren't many because it was a small town, 2 different AA meetings. And I just wasn't feeling it. I didn't relate. A lot of the people were older. A lot of the people had been sober many, many years. I just didn't get a feeling of acceptance. I personally decided to go to this NA meeting group. My roommates actually kept going to the AA meeting group. They liked it, so they kept going. And I found this NA meeting group that actually I think that was the first NA group you've been to, right?
Yeah, it was. Do you remember what our first meeting together was like?
Was that the one with my ex-girlfriend?
Yeah, it was. So I had kind of a crash course to NA. You and I have been dating, we'd only been dating like 2 or 3 weeks.
I probably didn't prepare you well enough for that meeting.
You didn't. You really, well, and I don't even think it was that meeting. I mean, just NA in general. I don't think you prepared.
12-step programs in general, yes.
Well, I knew 12-step programs because I had been to EDA meetings, but you had not prepared me for what Narcotics Anonymous would be like, because we've shared before on this podcast about my lack of experience with drugs and being exposed to drugs. And so I didn't understand a lot of the lingo. I didn't understand a lot of the struggles that people in NA were going to be struggling with. And I did not understand how intense some meetings could be. And this happened, not all meetings are intense. I mean, some meetings are straight boring, but this meeting happened to be a really intense one. And do you want to kind of talk everybody through what a candlelight meeting is? Because that's where you took me to my first NA meeting, was a candlelight meeting.
A candlelight meeting is simply where it's just a regular NA meeting, but with the lights turned off. And you'd be surprised that people are more willing to be more honest, be more open when the lights are off. And, there's 20 candles in the room, and people start sharing.
Yeah, they do. And you turned this into a date night. And so we got dressed up and we went to a nice dinner, which in this small town was probably either Olive Garden or Chili's or what else was there? Outback.
I miss Chili's.
Yeah, right. So before, when you could still have the honey chicken crispers. I mean, there were no nice restaurants in this small town where I went to grad school and where Tom went to rehab. But we went out to dinner and then we went to this meeting. It was like at 9 p.m., 9:30 p.m. So we got there. There was, it's a very eclectic place. It's this house that the group rents out, and everything's kind of just thrown together. It's like eclectic furniture that they could find anywhere. So there's like church pews and folding chairs. And do you remember there was that like adjacent room with those 4 couches that lined the walls?
Yeah, I never really knew what went on in that room because the meeting wasn't held in that room.
Right. But there were so many people there that night. We wound up having to sit over there next to your ex-girlfriend. She sat
right on next to us?
Yes, she sat. She came and introduced herself to me.
I remember that.
Asked me how long I had been clean. I told her I wasn't an addict. She gave you a hug and she sat right next to me and then proceeded to share about how in love she still was with the person she just broke up with and how it was making her want to use.
She did that at quite a few meetings.
Right. And that's fine. But it was so awkward. It was so awkward. And then everybody else started sharing, and the stories that they shared were so harrowing, and it genuinely was one of the most uncomfortable evenings of my life, because I felt like, as somebody who was not an addict, not a drug addict, that I didn't deserve to be there, because that anonymity, that Narcotics Anonymous, I felt like I was breaking that anonymity. And that actually is why we have been the most nervous about this particular episode, because of the anonymity that comes with 12-step programs. And we have had hours of discussion off the air about how best to handle this episode. And do you want to kind of talk everybody through? You had like an outright panic attack before recording, because you've been so worried, not about sharing your story, but about sharing about meetings.
I've had, some anxiety about sharing my story publicly, but most of my anxiety has been about what's called the 12 traditions of 12-step programs. They're probably all slightly worded differently depending on, whether it's AA or NA, but yeah, there's always been this principle of anonymity, that you should further the message of recovery anonymously. People have different perspectives on it. People interpret it differently. It's kind of like, I guess, the Bible. People have different interpretations on what it means. I came to the conclusion that I should never break anyone's personal individual anonymity, of course. Never share what is shared in meetings with somebody's name attached. Just some people have problems with you sharing that you're a member of AA or NA publicly. And I just disagree with that on a fundamental level because of the stigmatization we've talked about. I think addicts have been stigmatized unfairly for too long, and I'm tired of being anonymous.
That anonymity, I understand I understand the necessity of the anonymity, because for a lot of people, that's why they come. They wouldn't come if it wasn't anonymous, but in some ways that anonymity causes that stigmatization to be perpetuated. Like, I remember when I was pregnant with Ellie, our second child, our daughter, I used your keys to drive one of our cars, and you have a white NA key tag on your keychain. And we'll talk about key tags in a second, but I put my keys down at the store to get something on my bag, and a lady behind me made a comment to the person she was with about how disgusting it was that I was a junkie pregnant woman because she saw your key tag on my chain. And I am not a quiet person like you are. And I had a few choice things to say to her, and made my way out of the store, because there is that stigmatization that comes from even attending the meetings. Because if you attend the meetings, it means you're admitting that you are using. And you talked about how you don't want to be anonymous anymore. You know, that's one of the things, that stigma is part of why we've done this show, is in an effort that through breaking that anonymity to not be ashamed, and to change kind of that dialogue, at least in our circles and anybody who listens, about what being an addict is. But at your job, for example, they don't know that you go to NA meetings. They don't know you go to AA meetings, and they don't know about this podcast yet because we sought legal counsel before deciding to do this podcast because of the ramifications of doing it could have on your career, despite the fact that you're not actively in drug addiction. And that, I think, is an important point, because that anonymity is what protects you from those situations from occurring. But the continual, perpetual anonymity does nothing but perpetuate all those other assumptions and negative ramifications that come from admitting that you have a problem so that you can get help for it.
Yeah, I guess I'm just, I think anybody who wants to go to a meeting should not be, first of all, they should not be ashamed to go to a meeting, and they shouldn't have to worry about their identity being, exposed to the masses. They shouldn't have to worry about their employer. I think in the NA literature that's read at most every meeting I've been to says that, we are not under any surveillance, because when this meeting, when NA was started in the 50s, there were addicts that they were worried about being surveilled by the police. They were worried about assembling a group that the police would bust, even though that they were trying to get clean. So anonymity on an individual level is very important. And but it's just always caused a big conflict in me. I've just always felt very conflicted. I've always felt like I can't express my true self to a large part of society, my employer, my family, my friends who are not addicts. It's been difficult. I've always felt like I'm living a sort of double life. I don't think that I should. So when I come across as blunt or I make jokes about it, like about my using, I'm just trying to express the things that I struggle with, the things that make me, the things that my problems. And I don't think it's any different than anybody else's problems. Really. I think that everybody has problems. I don't think I'm special, but I like to talk about my problems.
Well, and that's what the meetings are for, right? It's a place for people who aren't ready to shed that anonymity yet to talk about it. And we had a listener, Eric S., that asked about open versus closed meetings, kind of talking exactly what we're talking about. They were talking about how they attend meetings with a loved one that is an addict and they are not an addict, and asked about how we deal with that awkwardness that I kind of was talking about attending that first meeting with you, and asked me if I have felt awkward, which yes, I will admit readily I do, or have, and have continued to feel awkward at other times when going to meetings with you, but then also to ask you if you are less likely to share with me there. And I thought that was a really interesting question because I don't think I've ever asked you that before.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. First of all, I've always had trouble sharing. I'm highly introverted. I had a sponsor. He was always encouraging me to share more, and it was always difficult. I felt like I had to, I felt like I couldn't really share the things I was really struggling with. And it's not that I couldn't share them. It's just some of these other people seem to be able to share some of the most intimate details of their life. And I had a lot of trouble. I guess it's easier maybe through a microphone. But yeah, you started going to this particular meeting here in Houston with me. And as an extrovert, you made friends with everybody, in the entire group in like a week. And I didn't share for like 6 months.
Yeah, they all kept asking me why we were together. They were like, you could do better than that.
What?
Yeah.
Well, they're wrong.
Well, not because you're not great, but because like you come across, and this is an introvert issue maybe, but like you come across sometimes as a dick because you just don't say anything. So people assume that you're an asshole, that you don't like anybody. And while you are incredibly misanthropic and you don't like most people, you aren't rude. You don't like them, but you're not a rude person.
No, I'm not at all. I'm a compassionate asshole.
Oh my God.
But yeah, there have been meetings you've attended where, say, like you and I got into a fight about something totally unrelated, and I may have been stressed, and I may have felt like using, and I may have wanted to go to a meeting and share about, oh, my wife pissed me off about this, blah, 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 because people do that all the time. But yeah, if your wife is not an addict and you go to a meeting and she's better, I mean, she's more well known than me, and she really likes to go because she has relationships there too. It can be hard. I think there's been times where I've wanted to ask you to stay home that night, and I wanted to go vent, but had you stayed home, I doubt I would have actually gone and vented.
I wonder though, why have you never asked me that? Because, I think that you and I have had a very open dialogue about this for a long time. And that surprises me that you wouldn't feel comfortable enough to ask me not, because I understand that, for you to ask me not to go.
I think the reason is because I saw that you, who has never had a problem with drugs, got a lot out of those meetings. And I would see you sitting there in those meetings and nodding and really like listening and hearing what people were saying. And you would come out of those meetings and be like, oh, so-and-so said something that really spoke to me. And I also knew that we live in Houston. I don't know. It's the third or fourth biggest city, in the United States, but there were hardly any eating disorder meetings, available. So, but to me, it didn't matter. Like, you were getting the message of recovery through a bunch of, crack, heroin, cocaine, whatever addicts. I mean, the message was just, it was the same, and you got a lot out of it. So I was never going to tell you to not go.
I think that's really interesting though, because perhaps that's why closed meetings exist. And for those of you who don't understand what we're talking about, open meetings are listed, anybody can go to them, addict or no. And closed meetings are only for those people who identify as drug addicts specifically. And you would have attended closed meetings before. I mean, since we've been together, a lot of the times you attended them because you just preferred those particular meetings and those particular time slots. But, open meetings I could go to with you. And before we had children, you and I have never attended church. That's not something that we do together. And I don't know if you'd agree with this, but in a lot of ways, NA for us was kind of what I feel like other people have like church for, where we would go and we would get messages that we would have really cerebral conversations about that would inspire us, that would make us feel better about things, that would release a lot of tension sometimes between us. Because you're talking about fights. Sometimes we would have a fight and then we would go and afterwards we'd have a great conversation because of what the topic was that night. It in a lot of ways was what I think a lot of devout Christians get out of going to church. There was a social aspect to it. We went to the socials. We had dinner parties where I cooked for all of your friends and our friends in the program. And they became our family here in Houston when we moved here, much like in Hattiesburg, where we attended meetings together before. That was our family unit in Hattiesburg. Then when we moved here, it was our community. I think that that's just very interesting to me, that I like that you recognize how much it meant to me, because I don't know if I ever expressed to you how much it meant to me. And I guess it was a lot more obvious than I thought it was.
It was obvious. It was obvious in the meetings. I remember.
And I want to make very clear, I never shared in these meetings, because whether you go to an open or a closed meeting, if you are a non-addict, it is practice that you don't share. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Right. There's meetings for family members of addicts where you can go and share. But yeah, you wouldn't share. You would just talk. You made very fast friends with everybody in the meeting just by talking before and after the meeting to people. When I was highly involved in NA, I would go every day, and
sometimes multiple times a day.
Sure. I mean, I didn't have a job. I didn't have anything else to do. And I think I said, you were very vulnerable, and you said, I've struggled. This is after you found out I was a drug addict, but you said, I've really struggled in the past with an eating disorder. And I said something like very bluntly, which I tend to do, like, "Oh, you're an addict. Cool. I understand. What I meant was, I understand the self-loathing. I understand why you would nod at what is said in an NA meeting, because to me, there wasn't much of a difference. And I think that you may still qualify that definition at times, or I don't know how you feel about it today, but at the time you were like, "What? No, I'm not an addict." Like, I think you were pretty offended.
I remember that conversation. I wasn't offended. Offended is the wrong word. I think I was confused. I think I thought that you misunderstood what I said, because for me, with food is very triggering for me, and it's all about language. Language is immensely important to me. And so when you called me an addict, for me, the connotation of what an addict was a drug user. And it was I thought about it in a very binary way. You have drug addicts and you have non-drug addicts. And I didn't use drugs, so I was in the non-drug addict, pile, the non-drug addict category. And I've learned since then, like most things in life, binary is a toxic thing. Anything that is binary, I think, is very problematic, and that there isn't just these neat categories that people fit into. I don't remember being offended, but I was confused by it. And since then, now that I have been in the rooms with you for a number of years and we've been dealing with your active addiction, I think that my definition is much more complex than it used to be. It's a lot more nuanced, that definition, than it used to be. But offended, I don't know. I don't know if offended is the right word.
It may not be offended, but you were definitely confused. To me, it was very black and white at the time. Now, I've read a lot of articles. I've read some negative articles about AA and NA and 12-step programs, and they say that, when you go to a meeting, you introduce yourself. If you're struggling with drugs or alcohol and you're going to a meeting, I mean, unlike you would just go with me. But if you're actually having a struggle with it and you wanted to share, you would say, my name is Tom and I'm an addict. My name is Tom and I'm an alcoholic, or, whatever was appropriate for the meeting. I mean, I've been to sex addict meetings before. I mean, whatever is appropriate for that meeting, that's how you introduce yourself. And it's been brought up that that sort of label is not helpful. The argument's been made that that's not helpful to the person recovering. So, and I've thought a lot about it. And, when I first got clean, it was so freeing to just be like, I'm a fucking crack addict. It was freeing because I wasn't smoking crack anymore. I remember, the first time I went to rehab, I embraced that. I was like, yeah, I'm a fucking addict. I can't be judged. I shouldn't be judged. I'm not using anymore. I'm a productive member of society. Yeah, I did this stuff. I turned my life around. Like, that should be a positive thing. I shouldn't have to hide it. I shouldn't have to hide it from employers. I shouldn't have to hide it from anybody. So yeah, fuck anybody. I'm a drug addict. Yeah, I mean, so what?
Absolutely. Yeah. But I don't think everybody feels that way, nor does everybody have the luxury to feel that way, because you and I are in a privileged group for multiple reasons. And I think that a lot of the people who are in the rooms don't have the ability to be quite so open, which is why that anonymity protects them. But I have to tell you, with regard to you, you're not a very easy person to get to know. And even after we were married, I still felt like there was a ton of mystery surrounding you and what made you tick and, what made up Tom Schlafly. And meetings are where I really got to know you, because you are, there's kind of two groups. I think you would agree. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two groups of people who share in meetings. There's the people who rarely share. And so when they do, everybody pays attention. You are in that category. And then there's the group of people who share every single meeting. And you were in that former category. And so when you would share, your shares were always really powerful and personal. And much like the way you share on this podcast, sometimes I get flashbacks where when we're doing this, I feel like we're in a meeting, because the way that you talk about your addiction on the show is very similar to the way that you talk about your addiction in the rooms. But I learned so much about you and so much about your history and about the pain that you had experienced, and pain with your dad and with your family, and pain with, your friends and your ex-girlfriends. And, I learned so much about what made you up. And I think that's the really amazing thing that the rooms can provide, is under that guise of anonymity, in that area, in that room where everybody either is a member of the addiction community or is supportive and an ally of the addiction community, hopefully, you can express those things. And you felt really comfortable in those meetings, more so than even sometimes with just you and I one-on-one in the early days of our marriage. You were more comfortable in a room sharing than you were sitting across a dinner table from me.
Well, I've never been comfortable sharing it in the rooms. I've forced myself to share because I thought that that's what I needed to do to recover. You're right that, I've been to many different meetings. When we moved here, I tried probably 50 different meetings. And even though I didn't feel comfortable necessarily in most of them, I always felt like I could share whatever I wanted to share. It was more of an internal conflict with, me block, not, wanting to share, not wanting to be vulnerable in front of a bunch of strangers. For me, it's never been easy. At the same time, it's been, I think when we started dating, I took you to these meetings because, I wanted you to know how fucked up I was, what I was dealing with, what people were like who were, had the same issues as me. I wanted you to realize that, because, unless you go into those meetings, I don't know if anybody can really understand the depth of this particular sort of compulsion. And as soon as you told me that, you had suffered from an eating disorder, I was like, oh, well, then she gets it on a fundamental level. And I knew when I brought you to those meetings and you started nodding that, they may have been talking about crack, but you got it.
Yeah. And you told me one time that that's when you knew that we would work out, is my reactions in the meetings. It was almost like, everybody kind of tests the people they're dating. It was almost like your test for me. You brought me there to see how I would react and see if I would fit in without being a user.
That's exactly right. I brought you around to see if you could not be repulsed by these people and understand that they're people who are struggling to do better in their lives. You saw them as human beings immediately.
Yeah, and I fell in love with a lot of those human beings. Not the way I fell in love with you, but I mean, genuinely, to this day, love a lot of those human beings. So we got 4 emails from listeners asking if I go to Eating Disorder Association meetings. And you mentioned a few minutes ago about how there's very few meetings here in Houston. And that has actually been a huge struggle for us since we moved here. I tried to find some places to go. There was one meeting at 11 a.m. on a Saturday that I could go to, and that was really it. And so it's very difficult. I think one thing that people in the rooms of NA and AA maybe sometimes take for granted is the amount of meetings that you have access to. When we moved here, you probably attended 100 meetings to try to find a place. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, between 50 and 100.
Right. And I had 3 that I could choose from, 2 of which that were almost, and I mean, people don't realize how huge Houston is. Houston is 100 square miles across. And so we live in one part of the city, and it could take an hour and a half to get to another part of the city, depending on traffic. Just geographically is massive. And there's very few EDA meetings here, but I did want to talk, because we had so many people ask about it, I did want to talk a little bit about EDA meetings, which are very similar to both NA and AA. They are 12-step meetings. When I first started going to EDA meetings, I did not have the same reaction that you had to NA meetings, I don't think. And I wanted to kind of talk to you about that. When I started going to EDA meetings, I went because I was told I needed to go. And like with anything in any recovery, if you're not really committed and don't want to be there, it isn't particularly helpful. It doesn't particularly work. But I found them incredibly useful when my eating disorder was still active, because I used them to figure out new ways to restrict my food. The internet, we're going to show our age here. The internet was around, but, they didn't have Google. I couldn't get on Google and search, right? They didn't have Google, right? 2002?
No, Google was started in 1998.
So I had Google?
Well, you may not have used it, but it was around.
I just don't remember Google.
Well,
I remember Ask Jeeves.
It wasn't, yeah.
I used Ask Jeeves. I remember that.
Yeah, Ask Jeeves. I mean, yeah.
Jeeves and I had many conversations about eating disorders.
What'd you ask him?
Like, best ways to increase my potassium level without eating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Google was much better at providing you answers, but I guess you didn't know.
I didn't have the search engine capabilities that I have today, or people that are in active eating disorders have today. And so EDA meetings were a huge useful tool for me, because girls would share, and I say girls because I don't know if I ever went to an EDA meeting with a man. I don't think I ever did. But not that there are many men who struggle with eating disorders, but the meetings I have been to have been predominantly female. I mentally would take down everything everyone was sharing, and I would go and try and apply it to my own, what I considered ironically to be my program at the time, which was how I was going to best not eat. And I was just curious, is that something that also happens in AA rooms?
I think it's slightly different. It's I can see some of the similarities there. I certainly there's drug deals and you can meet people at NA meetings, and you can kind of pick out the ones who can give you hook you up to deal you drugs, but it's not like a process disorder where they can give you strategies to use. It was more along the lines of, can you get me physically a chemical? And I've never used meetings for that, but I know people who have. I know people who have said, I don't like going to meetings because it makes me feel like using, because of all this talk about using. But the only way we can deal with it is to talk about it, whether it's at a 12-step meeting or a therapist or a smart recovery meeting. Or, I mean, we have to talk about it. We have to have a forum to talk about it.
Yeah, well, and food is very different, right? Because I didn't have to go out and look for drugs. I didn't have to go, figure out how to use them. I mean, restriction of food or purging of food is much easier in terms of like the accessibility to it than drugs are. But, I did eventually find eating disorder association meetings once I was committed to getting help very, very helpful for the same reasons that NA and AA, I think, helped you and have helped me, as you've pointed out. I would love to attend EDA meetings more regularly if they existed. And you remember, I actually looked into in 2015, I looked into trying to what it would take to start one. You remember, I contacted the Eating Disorder Association and we tried to figure out, what that would take. And the problem was there were all of these groups that had been started and then stopped here in Houston because people just don't know about it as much. In movies, they have NA meetings. In movies, they have AA meetings. They have those things. I don't know if I've ever seen a fictionalized movie that wasn't a documentary where people go to EDA meetings.
NA and AA meetings, they're definitely much more readily available. When we bought our house, we moved a little bit north of the city, and there's not very many NA meetings up here. There are some AA meetings, and I've been to them. Really, I prefer this NA meeting down closer to my work. They're a lot, either way, NA and AA are a lot more prevalent. They're a lot more accessible than EDA meetings. But still, I prefer, like you said, I went to maybe 50 to 100 different groups, and I found one that I liked. I think sometimes it takes a lot of perseverance to find a meeting that's right for you.
So turning back to NA meetings, we had 3 emails. Maggie, Trisha, and Jake R. all wanted to kind of for us to have a further conversation about clean time, which is a huge part of NA and AA, which is how much clean time do you have? And on our episode 3, you kind of gave a definition of clean time and talked about how you felt like it wasn't your place to define what it means to be clean for any addict other than yourself. But at one time, you were obsessed with clean time. You were absolutely obsessed with it. And I remember I made you that shadow box. At this point, you had up to 18 months. And NA, they give key tags. They're keychains. And they're different colors for the different amounts of clean time you have. And in AA, they're chips. They look like coins, but they call them chips. And I took all of your NA key tags and I made this shadow box with all your key tags, and I gave it to you to hang. We just moved in together for us to hang in our house. And you got very, very emotional when I gave it to you because you kind of took it as me fully accepting the program and accepting you and all of that. And eventually, when you stopped going to NA meetings for a while, and after you came back from rehab the second time, I mean, that box now is in a box in our attic. You completely kind of changed your feeling about clean time. And can you talk a little bit about how complicated that journey has been for you?
It's been difficult. Before I relapsed, I fell away from 12-step programs. People in 12-step programs would say I had a resentment against 12-step programs. I had a philosophical issue with the definition of clean time well before I relapsed. I'm not sure what was going on with me. I know I was suffering from depression, and I know I had some anger at 12-step programs. I remember doing step work and with my sponsor, and just, it's like I knew exactly what that, everybody wanted to hear. I don't want to say it stopped working, but I would say maybe I stopped working, but it felt like it stopped working. And so I eventually, relapsed. After that, the shadow box you talked about, it's like, it's just, as an addict, it's like all or nothing. I mean, everything is all or nothing. Everything is binary. Everything is, black and white. It's very hard once you relapse to go back into those meetings, to get back into it. I tried, if you remember. I mean, from the first time I relapsed, I tried to go back and I tried to go back. I relapsed several more times. It was very difficult. I found help through therapy since the second time I went to rehab. And I've, started going back to this one particular group that I like, but it's been difficult. I've had a complicated relationship with 12-step programs.
We actually got 2 emails from listeners who asked to not be identified, who spoke kind of what you were talking about. They specifically wanted to ask you how you went back, because they have both experienced, and they knew that I was going to talk about their emails without mentioning their names. They gave permission for that, but they both have recently suffered relapses, and they're having a lot of trouble making their way back, because I think that's a common thing. But what I think is interesting about what you're saying is, the first time you got clean, you also felt that way. Could you share that story about what it was like the first time you picked up a tag other than the white entry tag to NA?
The first time was, I was in a rehab facility. So they would take us to NA meetings in a bus. They would bus us over to the YMCA. They called it the druggy buggy that we would pile into. And, one of the nights I was in there, I had just finished smoking a Marlboro Red. It was so delicious. Driver, he didn't care, but he was like, whoever is in here is loud. And he was talking about the smell of the cigarettes. And it's like, you guys got to be more discreet. I think a couple days after that, I got caught. I wonder if he narked on me. But, we would go to this meeting. I remember I was still in withdrawals. There was an old man there who was getting 34 years. I think it was 32 or 34 years clean. I just couldn't comprehend that amount of time. I mean, that amount of time clean. He wasn't like a lot of these other people that before I had gone to this rehab, when I was, using, and, before I went to treatment, I would go to meetings, and most of the time I was, high or drunk or whatever. But there'd be people with 30 years, and most of them were cranky, kind of mean, actually. But this guy was just very gentle. I remember going up to him after the meeting, several of us did, and saying, how on earth did you get that long? Because at that point I was maybe 21 days clean. Every day was a struggle. And I remember him saying that he said, you want to know who has the longest amount of clean time? So we were all like, yeah, who set the record for this? Whoever woke up earliest today. We were like, whoa, that's like Yoda's shit. That kind of blew our minds. I was like, well, they make us wake up pretty early here, so fuck it, I'll stay another day. And when I got to 30 days, they had these in-house meetings, and they would hand out key tags there. So I didn't want to get a key tag at this meeting that they would bus us to, because there was like 100 people there. I didn't want to get up in front of all those people. But I was so proud, and I got up there, and they were like, well, we're actually out of the 30-day key tags, but you can have a hug. But they ordered more, and I mean,
sometimes in those meetings, people take it off their own keychains. I mean, I've seen people that have more clean time, like if a kid goes up to get a 3-month or whatever, like somebody's taking their own 3-month off and giving it to them.
Oh, for sure. But in rehab, I mean.
I'm sorry. This was in rehab. This wasn't
rehab.
the druggy buggy meeting.
No. So like in rehab, like everybody, they're not going to give their own
Never mind
30-day key tag. I mean, because I was so proud when I finally did get it when it came in, I was so proud because I really honestly didn't think that I could stay clean that long, despite all my maybe resentments or sometimes anger, outright anger towards 12 steps and philosophy of it and the unavailability of meetings and all this. I think that what's good is the single thing it offers is community. I mean, I met you because I went to 12 steps.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that because, when you stopped going to NA meetings, it was very difficult for me because I did enjoy going to them so much, and it had become a huge part of what was a massive part of your life, and it had become a huge part of mine. And for years, you credited the program with having saved your life, and then all of a sudden, you weren't going anymore, and it almost felt like you were rewriting this narrative and the history of what both you and I knew that both NA and AA had done for you. But I hate platitudes. That's my least favorite part of 12-step meetings, the group think, the slogans. But I can't believe I'm going to use one right now. But there's that thing that everybody says at the end of an NA meeting, which is, or at least the ones that we've gone to, keep coming back. It works if you work it. And if you don't want to work it, it doesn't matter if you keep coming back because it doesn't work.
It's kind of like, I guess I've always felt like it's sometimes I don't feel like getting out of bed and going to work. Sometimes I don't feel like taking my son to the park. And then when I do, it's like, oh, I feel better. I feel better about myself. But if you're in the midst of a depression or you have things going on in your life, it can be really hard. Like, I remember forcing myself to go. I remember chairing meetings and somebody telling me, it really looks like you do not want to be chairing. I think that was a way of telling me that I didn't do a very good job. But, I guess the same could be said for you with Al-Anon meetings, because my mother she attended Al-Anon meetings for a couple of years. I know, have attended a couple, but I know how many AA meetings I have had to attend to find a meeting that I liked. You probably have not tried as many of those meetings as I have.
I don't know if I call it a couple. I've been to way more than I wanted to go to, or a couple. You're right, though. I mean, you deserve to call me out for that because it's true. I don't think I have given Al-Anon the chance that perhaps I could have given it. For those of you who don't know what Al-Anon is a group that basically is made up for those of us that are non-addicts, non-drug addict, or non-alcoholics that come together to talk about our shared experience of being the loved one of a user. I think my problem with Al-Anon is from the get-go, I picked a bad meeting and it left a really bad taste in my mouth. I have a character flaw where I'm very difficult to have my mind change once it's made up about something. And I can be very judgmental in that way. And it's not okay, but it's something that I do. And so if I don't value the person giving me their opinion, I typically don't value the opinion. And that's, again, not okay, but it's Ashley Schlafly. It's part of my issue. And so what that first meeting at Al-Anon that I went to, I was about 7 months pregnant with Finn. It was the same time it was like around the same time you were detoxing in the bathtub that we talked about. And I shared in the meeting about what was going on with you. I remember being very emotional in that meeting, and I was expecting people to be welcoming, kind of like they are in the NA rooms. And the first person who walked up to me, introduced themselves to me, gave me their number, and then handed me another piece of paper with a number for what she said was the best divorce lawyer in Houston. And I remember thinking, what the fuck? Like, these are not my people, because I just refused to believe that the only choice was that we weren't going to be able to be together anymore. And I think that really tainted me against the whole group there, because the ones that I have been to, I have not found immense amounts of commonality with the people there, because while we have a shared experience of loving an addict, all those addicts are different. All of their compulsions are different, and they're all approaching their addiction differently, much the same way I didn't feel like I related at all to people at the family weeks that we've been to. I also didn't feel like I related to the people in Al-Anon.
That's very common. It's a very common experience for people going to AA or NA as well. I mean, I've had that experience. I hear that quite a bit. It takes a lot of experimentation. And, I've also found that there are options outside of 12 steps. I mean, there's a group called Smart Recovery. I haven't been to it, but it's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's rooted in that. I've had a lot of, I think you would agree, positive, beneficial experiences from working with a therapist over many years on an individual basis. But the 12 step programs provide a community. But if that community, is not your community, I don't think it matters. I mean, you can go as many times as you want, but you're not going to fit in. And I've done that for many groups. And I've only found a few that I truly fit in. But when you do, it's very powerful.
Again, yeah, I think you're right. I think that Al-Anon is something that I probably, again, need to revisit, because we know people who've gotten an immense amount of comfort and solace out of attending Al-Anon. And so that's another thing to put on the to-do list. There's one final question from a listener that I think is probably a very controversial question, and I think it's going to make you immensely uncomfortable, but I think it's worth asking. Chris W. wrote in and asked whether or not you feel that sometimes addicts that become clean replace their addiction to drugs with an addiction to attending meetings. And I was just curious, because when you got clean, you were Mr. NA. It was the most important thing in your life until we got together. And even when we got together, there were times that we had fights about, like, NA was like the other woman in our relationship sometimes. I mean, we would get into fights about how much you were doing step work and attending meetings and sponsoring people and going to meetings with your sponsor. NA was a obsession almost of yours. And it was an obsession that saved your life. Please know, I'm not saying it didn't. But what do you think about that question?
I think I've thought the exact same thing as Chris. I know I've said that, especially in my 20s, because I would know people who went to these meetings while, I was using. It seemed like they had joined some cult. I guess that goes back to sort of our definition of what is an addict. I guess if we defined it as using it to fill a hole, well, then yeah, it filled a hole. It filled a hole beneficially instead of negatively.
Using your metaphor of filling a hole, I think the problem is that drugs fill that hole in a very temporary way. The hole was evident again after the drugs wore off. I think there's lots of things that we fill holes in our lives with that are healthy. I mean, you talked about how we had a friend that accused you of, when we were dating, after we got engaged, of being addicted to me, that you were addicted to our relationship and you were using our relationship like a drug. And we talked about that with a therapist at some point, who talked about how that healthy relationship that you and I developed, that filled in a hole permanently. And so I agree with what Chris is saying. I think that he's right, that you have a compulsion to use, and in an effort not to use, you replace that compulsion with attending meetings. The question is if what you're using to fill that hole fills it in a permanent and lasting way.
Well, I would say that it's transient in the sense that if you stop going to meetings like I did, I eventually relapsed. I guess the whole issue is whether it's filling a hole in a positive or negative way. And that's not for you or I to judge about anyone else. For me to define, It's a interesting question because I know how annoying some of these people can be. I know how annoying meetings are. I'm not saying that 12-step programs are the only solution, but it's been one of the best things that's helped me.
I am immensely grateful to NA, despite having never used drugs other than marijuana and alcohol. I love NA and I love the people that we've met in NA, and many of them are listening now to us. They can hear us. We won't name them by name, but for me, Narcotics Anonymous doesn't just save the life of the addict, it saves the people attached to them. And the program, when successful and embraced, I mean, its impact is pervasive in the best way. Because of NA, because of the people we met in the rooms, I got to sit with you after watching you use and thinking that you would die because you were using so much. I got to sit with you in a room clean with our 3-month-old son, with our 6-month-old son. We used to bring him to meetings, and I have you today in part. We have another child. Both our children have their father, not because of NA, but because of the people that were in those rooms that help you work your program. And I am so eternally grateful to them because in a lot of ways, they gave you back to me. They helped you find your way through and they helped you get there, like they say, one day at a time. And I hope and hold out hope that one day you will go back because I want our children to grow up in the rooms. I want our children to see all of that. And I'll always be grateful to NA for it.
I have been going just recently. I've started going back again. And what was interesting was, I decided I really only wanted to go to this one particular meeting. Since we moved so far away, I mean, it's 45 minutes away. I hadn't been in a long time. And basically, I worked late one night and I made a meeting there and I hadn't been there in over 2 years. It was amazing how many people remembered me, asked me how I was doing. I said, well, since, the last time I saw you, I probably relapsed, and they were just so welcoming. The people are what makes these programs. I mean, when I walk into some place that I haven't stepped foot in over 2 years, 10 people remember my name and I can't even remember any of their names. And they asked me about my son, my 6-month-old son, who, is now much older. And they asked me about my wife and they remember your name. That shit makes me feel good. And that's what a meeting is supposed to feel like. That's what a community is supposed to feel like. So I understand when you go to a meeting for the first time, you don't feel that. I understand why it could seem not for you, but it takes time to develop. It's very powerful once it's developed.
That's kind of why we're doing this podcast, because we were hoping that this podcast would be cathartic for us and maybe help one or two people. And we have been so moved, and I don't mean to be like cheesy, but we've been moved by some of the reviews that have been left, because we've had multiple reviews talk about how when they listened to the show, they felt like they were in the rooms. That has meant a lot to us because we take that as the highest of compliments, because the best part of NA, the best part of AA, there's this power that comes in our sharing, and that power is multiplied when we speak from our shared experiences. And that is the point of this show, to orient ourselves within these boundaries of our similarities rather than focusing on our differences. And whether we restrict our food, whether we overeat, use drugs, work too much, we're all struggling. We all are aiming to find ways to be fucking better, to live better, and to survive.
That's the goal.
I want to point out to all of our listeners who can't see you right now that you have a big smirk on your face. Your cynicism always comes through because it is the goal. And I understand that it's a difficult goal to achieve. We're at least trying to achieve that by creating this little community to create a room of our own, because this is part of your program and my program. And whether you have a formal program or not, we appreciate you being a part of ours.
For sure. And it's a lot easier for me to share into a microphone rather than to a bunch of strangers in person.
Even though there's really a lot more strangers listening than there would be if you were in a neighborhood. It
doesn't feel like it here.
Well, and see, what no one understands is you do, I don't know if you even realize you do this, what you do on this podcast, you do in the rooms too. You close your eyes when you talk.
I would share with my eyes closed.
Yes, you share with your eyes closed, and you record like half the time your eyes are closed.
Well, I'm thinking.
I know, but you have a trouble making eye contact in general, but you refuse to make eye contact in meetings. And even with me, we sit, when we record, we sit across from each other. You don't even make eye contact with me.
That's how I feel most comfortable.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, we want to thank all of you for listening. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter at NoNeedPod. My personal Twitter is at Ashley Schlafly. Tom's is at Tom_Schlafly. Or you can send us an email at noneedpod@gmail.com. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and most other podcast applications. And we ask that you please hit that subscribe button, no matter where you are listening to us, so you can be sure to stay up to date with our show. And if you've not had a chance to yet, please leave us a 5-star review. It really does help us grow our audience, grow our listening base, and get a little bit higher up in those search results. As always, thanks for listening, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with you next time here at No Need to Argue.